We'll go ahead and get started if you want to pull up the PowerPoint. So chapter 9 is about maintaining state. And so the big two things that we work with in this chapter are what are called session state, which we have not worked with before, and cookies, which we also have not done anything with before, at least in this semester. And so that's basically the two big new things that we're going to take out of this chapter. And so, kind of getting into the theory behind state, the first thing that any conversation about state happens, you learn that HTTP is considered stateless, right? Which means that the client basically says, hey, I want a resource, and then the server responds with that resource, and then the server forgets all about that client. They have no sort of way of remembering who each other are. So HTTP, of course, that's the protocol of the internet or the World Wide Web, and it's inherently stateless. So as a way to remember each other, be it the client being remembered by the server, you need to start to maintain state. And so there's different ways that you can maintain state. Things that we've done so far, we've kind of maintained state using some routes. And so you got your thing pulled up.
It's still loaded off to as it's being recorded.
It is being recorded, and I will share my screen. I thought maybe that's the other thing that I typically forget to do. So yeah, it's being recorded, and I am going to share my screen right now.
Okay, it just pulled up. You said it would cost us 50?
Yeah. Yep. So when we're storing it in our routes, that's actually in the URL itself, where you say, hey, this is item ID number 5, and it's in the route of item number 5. Why can't I type on this? I must have not enabled editing. Let me close this. Reopen it. Enable editing. There we go. There we go. So of course we get, local host, port number 1700, customer, add, or edit, and 5. And so you put a little piece of information up in the route, and that kind of helps transfer information between the client and server. And so that's one way of maintaining state. We've learned a little bit. If you want to send information from one controller to another controller, we've worked with temp data in this textbook and in the past. We have stored some information in a hidden field. Of course, you guys will remember input type of hidden. And so that's in the HTML. And you'll have an ASP4 attribute and say, customer ID or whatever it may be. And so we're sending information again between the client and server in a hidden field. Vinny, before this recording started, you just said, hey, did you know chess.com uses query strings? And so that tells me you understand at least that a query string is basically up in the URL, but it comes after the route. So you get a question mark. You get a question mark here, and you start putting more information up in the URL, such as, sort by last name, something like that. You can append additional information to then read out of from the controller, read it out and apply that to your query. These are the new ones in this chapter, right? So it's just this first page is a good overview, I think, just to say, hey, HTTP is stateless. There's a lot of different approaches on how to maintain state and save information. Today we're going to talk primarily about session state, and then tomorrow we'll get into cookies. The big difference between these two is that cookies are stored client side, and session state is stored server side. And so we're persisting data. We're starting to save data. And we're going to learn the server side approach today, and then we'll get into client side tomorrow. Of course, cookies are the primary tool more than anything else, I feel like, is working with cookies. But maybe I'm wrong about that. So this is just, hey, let me look at this. How ASP.NET Core keeps track of a session. Okay, so as we're getting into session state, this is information stored on the server. Now, is it stored in RAM? Is it stored in some sort of cache? Is it some sort of like cache on the hard drive, cache in the processor? The book doesn't really get into that technical side. The one thing I will say about saving a lot of data in session state is, you can, if you've got a lot of clients and all these clients are storing a lot of data on the server, that can definitely bog down your server. So that's kind of the disadvantage of storing a lot of things in session state, is that, you're using server resources to do so, whereas cookies, you're storing your data more client side. Of course, you shouldn't take someone's, sensitive information and store it client side. It's considered more secure to save information on server side. So just a couple pros and cons of each. But basically what the server is going to do, and what this shows you, is it just generates a little ID. The client says, hey, give me a web page, and the server will create a session ID, right? So a session ID is created, and then the server sends that session ID back to the client, and now they have a way of remembering one another. Okay, a session by default has a timeout, right? So when the session ID is created, 20 minutes, I believe, is the default duration. You can change that, and so depending on the needs of your site, if you need it, to stay in memory longer or shorter, you can change that default duration. But it's basically the session ID is going to be passed back and forth, and then the instead of the client being completely forgot about, now the server can use that session ID to say, hey, I got some information that I'm working with for you, that I've saved for this particular session. And so one way to terminate a session is by a timeout, and that would be like the server terminating it. The client can also terminate a session just by closing the browser. And so a session can be terminated in those two ways: by the client, by just closing the browser, and by the server. Okay. And so to configure .NET to use session state, there's a couple of method calls that we need to do in our program CS. And so we basically need to call these methods for us to be even able to create these session state variables, essentially. Okay, and so I'll spin up a Visual Studio MVC app and kind of code along with this. Create a new project. Okay, so 3 lines of code inside of our program.cs that basically enable session state. So here, builder.services.add memory cache. Builder services.add session. Okay, so 2 method calls here, And the book will note must be called before add controller with views. Okay, add memory cache. Again, this is stored in a cache on the server. So let's enable that, and we're add session. Again, that's what we're doing. We're adding session state to our app. And before the route, so here's map controller route. We're going to call app.use session. Okay, those are the 3 lines that are needed to enable session state. Must be called before routes are mapped. Okay, and so you could just think of those as the first steps to enabling session state. Okay, so let's close program CS. Let's close that. I'm going to open up kind of my home controller. And let's kind of delete what's not needed. I'm going to get rid of this logger. And I'll get rid of my privacy.
You ever told us what that is out of the box, all that like logger stuff?
Well, I think there's well, typically what a logger is
Tracks your info, doesn't it? Sounds like.
well, a lot of times you're using logging in troubleshooting, and so you can log to like a Windows log or an event log.
You can log like get and post requests and stuff too to see.
So think of like what we used to do in the terminal window, right? We would just log variable values and that kind of stuff. So what we need to first do is create a session variable and kind of see how this all works. And so here in our index, I'll explain this line of code as I go through it. Int num equals http context dot session dot this isn't the first line in the book, but I'll come back so we can explain it first, because sorry. There we go, and return to the view. Okay, now out of the book, I wrote it verbatim out of the book, and you're going to notice it basically gave me a little error. Cannot implicitly convert a nullable int into a non-nullable int. And so I just added the question mark here and made this num. So what is this doing? Okay, so it says, hey, go into the session and see if there's a session variable called num. So this is a read, and store it in this variable called num. Now, if it doesn't exist, we'll add one to it. If it does exist, it'll be a number, and we'll increment it by 1. So regardless of this read operation, so read from session variables called session variable called num. And so you're either going to get a null value back or you're going to get an int. Obviously, get int 32 is our data type. We then increase it by 1. And we then write it. And it says, can I convert from nullable int to... I don't think that's going to work in this case. Let me fix this. Okay, so kind of step through. Again, the book code wasn't exactly coming out, and so this was our fix. And so since we're reading a potential null value, we add 1 to it, and this is casting it to an int. So basically what we did is we added this word int in front. Okay, but if we break this down, this is reading from a session variable called num. It's either going to return null or it's going to return some integer value. We then add an integer to it and then store that back in the same num variable stored in session state, and takes us back to our view. So on our view, let's go view home index, and let's read out of the session variable. And so let's have a div here. All right, and we'll break this down a little bit more. Now you're going to notice inside of the controller, the class is HTTP context.session, and inside of the view is just context.session. Ultimately, this session object implements the interface called iSession. So both this session object here and this session object here, you know, they both implement the same interface, which ultimately makes it a session. But, you know, that's just one takeaway, you know, is that the property HTTP context in the controller versus the property of context in the view. And this is just, let's launch it and see what breaks now. Yeah. So we tried to, let's put in a breakpoint and hit that breakpoint. Okay, so num is currently null, and then we go and we add 1 to, but adding 1 to null still results in null. So it was my fault originally for trying to make this nullable, but then the question becomes, so I'm going to stop. What is the appropriate fix? So what I'm doing is I'm refactoring this. If num is null, we'll just overwrite it to be equal to 1. Otherwise, num plus equals 1. So we'll get it into an int one way or another. I want this to
That
not...
block is doing the same thing that he was doing at conviction.
Okay, so now let's put a breakpoint in here. And the other thing that I need to bring in is we need to do a read.
Well, I think the
No,
thing
that's
is just the same thing. If you
Yeah,
want to
it's
make it a code block.
that's
or
right.
expression, yeah.
That's right. So let's put it in a breakpoint now. We should see that Literally just compiled. Okay. Now you're happy with me. Okay. Okay, so let's step through this line by line. I started by writing this, and getInt32 returned a nullable int. So I changed this to a nullable int. Then I needed to test for null, and if it was null, just assign it to 1. Otherwise, we increment by 1. And then we write that value to a session variable called num, and then we go back to the view. And then over here in the view, I access that variable through the context session getInt32, and up we go. Now, if I restart, again, we can terminate on the client end, right? So terminating on the client end gets that to start back over. Notice if I have even multiple tabs going, right? Multiple tabs, tab, tab, tab. It's just on a per browser basis, right? So I've got a session variable with Firefox, but it's also worth pointing out that if I open this up in a different browser, let's just say Chrome, that would start it back over. Here's my instance of Chrome, right? So Firefox is counting up separately than my Chrome, so it appears like a different session, right? Different browser, different session. You close it, it starts over. A little more challenging than I remember. I don't remember having to jump through these hoops, but nonetheless, we got to it. Looking at the different, getInt32, of course, if I were to look at the different methods, we can get ints and we can get strings, but there's really not a whole lot of different types built into here. So storing strings and ints, obviously you want to store more than that probably. And so we get into real quick working with JSON. And so in C#, of course, we have classes, and there's a concept that we may or may not remember called serialization. And serialization is this concept of like, hey, taking a class and converting it into basically a stream of bytes to store it. And so you do a lot of serialization, like when you're writing to a file, for example, you want to serialize your objects. That makes it so that you can write it, in maybe to a file or maybe to a database. And so I think of serialization as this process of taking your object and its state, like the state of your object, and converting it so that you can store it. So serializing is a kind of like converting it into a storage, and then deserializing is getting it out of the storage. And so that's what we wind up doing. We're going to work with JSON, and we're going to save our objects into session state using this serializing and deserializing. So again, if I could kind of try and high level this, we're going to have an object, and we're going to serialize it to save it to our session variable. And then when we read it from the session variable, we deserialize it. Now, in order to do this, we have to have a class, and in the book example, the class is our team that we picked up with chapter 8, where we were working with our NFL teams. And so I might close this and open up a previous code along that we were doing. So if I go to GitHub, and Chapter 8 NFL teams. So this is kind of where we left off with our code along. I'm just opening this so we have access to our team class. So now inside of models, we have a team. And a team has a name and a conference and all these other things. Okay, so I'm going to close all of this out. I just wanted access to my team class so that I can demonstrate creating a team, serializing, that's a fun word, serializing that, basically converting it so that you can store it into a session variable and then converting it back out of the session variable. So let's boot this up. And see, we've got like a home controller. So here's our controller, home controller, and here's our index method. All right, and I'm just going to hard code something kind of at the top here that demonstrates basically how to take an object, bring it back just a little bit. So kind of like built into what we can do out of the box is like, oh, you want to store a string in a session variable? You got those methods. You want to store an int in a session variable? You got that. But you might want to store something more complex. And so that's where we get into this additional approach of serializing an object and deserializing an object. This object is going to be a team. And so team and team ID. Okay, so now we've got an object. There is no, methods to get an object, if you will. So we're going to serialize this into our session variable. So up at the top, we're going to add a using system text JSON. Okay. So we have a team object. We have a method called JSON serialize.serialize, and we're passing our team into that. So that's going to get this team basically into a JSON format, which is essentially a string, right? Key value pairs, all that kind of fun stuff inside of a string. And then we're going to take that JSON string and save it to our session variable. So here's HTTP context session set string team, passing it our JSON string. Right? So that takes this little team data, stores it in a string, takes it from that string, puts it into our session variable. Then what we have to do to read it out, we have to get the string, then we have to deserialize it back into the team object, and then you could use it from there. Let's go view, home, index. And here's a little block here, so let's bring in there we go. So here we got to use context session instead of HTTP context. Let's bring in so what I'm trying to do is bring it into the view, and they don't have that. Just want to put that string right inside a paragraph. There we go, JSON serializer. I just had to bring in the using statement. Deserialize. Okay, now we have a variable that we can use. Team dot Okay, so create an object, serialize the object, write it to a session variable called team. Read from the variable called team into a string, deserialize that into a team object, and then you can access and I've got a naming conflict. So we'll just call my team. I'm going to send you guys on break and I'm going to troubleshoot. Fun times. It's pretty obvious what I did. It says it has not been, this application has not been configured for an application or request.
Oh, you didn't put the.
I didn't put the 3 lines inside of program CS.
That is pretty.
So I'll fix that while you guys are on break. Okay, so I'm adding these couple of lines. Okay, Seattle Seahawks, so that's working. I probably did not, in my controller, I gave them a name and a team ID, but I did not give them the conference. So if I kind of come back in here and set the conference, oh, it's not a string. My model of a is a new conference. Yeah, so conference isn't a straightforward thing. So let's just, instead of pulling out conference, just pull out the team ID. That way we don't have to get that. There we go. Okay, so as you guys are coming back, I pointed out, you know, hey, I got a different app here than I had before. Of course, I needed to modify my program CS with these 1, 2, 3 lines. And then everything worked. And so again, to just kind of walk through all that's been done, not a lot of lines of code have been added, but just more theory and practice on how it can be done. So we serialized some integer data, and now we're serializing and or saving to a session variable an object. So here's our team object. Line 1 basically converts it into JSON, into a string of JSON. And line 3 saves it into our session variable named team. And then I had to bring in JSON on our view using system text JSON. A couple lines of C# that reads out of a session storage, get the string called team, and then deserialize that team object. Yeah, right. Right.
Like where you get those from, and like how they're accessed.
It's kind of like, you know, view bag, and these are just things that are available to us. The session object, as you can kind of see here, the session object inside of context, and if you look at this, the signature that I'm looking at, it says iSession, right? So we're implementing that iSession interface, and so they are, I mean, like HTTP context just, well, it is available here, but it doesn't work. So, you know, this is just the theory out of the book is like, hey, if you're accessing it from a view, you're using context. If you're accessing it from a controller, it's HTTP context .session. But they both implement the same interface, which is why you're able to read and write session objects.
So it's kind of like view bag and view data. You
Yeah.
can access the same thing.
Yep, just built into, and they make it a point. It's like, you know, this is how it's done on ASP.NET Core version 3 and up. It's like a newer, you know, syntax for doing it. All that, again, we haven't written a whole lot of code, but we have done a simple operation of writing to a session variable and reading from a session variable. Now, from there, because really we have two operations that's going on. We're basically converting an object into a JSON string, and then we're writing that string to our session variable, right? So we have 2 lines of code. You know, the book says, hey, you know, you could simplify that. You could simplify these 2 lines, which are doing 2 different things, in this fashion. And so they write what's called an extension method. And so an extension method is something that exists in C# and other languages, where you have a class. This class is the session class. And if you look at the session class, we got HTTP context dot session dot, and we've got some methods that are available to it. And so these are all the methods that are available to that class. An extension method is kind of what it sounds like, in that you're extending a class and adding new methods to it. And so, long story short, we're going to make a couple of extension methods to take these 2 lines of code down into 1 line of code. And kind of the same thing here. We've got these 2 lines of code, and it more or less cleans that up, right? If you view that as, well, you could write that more efficiently, that's kind of what they're going for here. They're going to write this extension method. The extension method is going to extend the iSession interface. That iSession interface is implemented by this class of session. So we'll be able to have some new methods to us, all right, and simplify that. So I don't think we wrote extension methods in the C# class. So this is kind of an opportunity to get, you know, another piece of theory of C# that we haven't done before. So in this models folder, I'm going to add a class. Session extensions. And we're going to write a method takes a generic type. So we've worked with like lists, for example. A list can be a list of ints, or a list can be a list of teams, or a list can be a list of anything. So when we say a set object, this is a generic type. So when you call set object, you can pass in various types. So this is called a generic type. And the way to extend the iSession interface, the first argument you pass here is this iSession called session. And so when you're making an extension method, the first argument is basically what are you extending? In this case, we're extending the iSession interface. The iSession interface is implemented by, as we saw, that session class. We're going to pass in a key, which is going to be the session key, like team. In this case, our key was team, lowercase team. Same thing here. This is our key. And then the third thing is our value, right? So this is the interface that we're extending. This is the key, and this is the value. And we can call session, and you're going to see how we kind of combine the two method calls, key, JSON serializer. Oh, let's go ahead and bring in the JSON using statement. Serialize.
You're missing a closing parentheses on that.
Good eye. And public static class. Okay. So again, we're extending the iSession interface, and essentially we're doing the set string and the serialize the two lines of code in essentially in one. So now when we call a set object, it'll do both. Of course, we have to be able to read it out as well. So this is a write operation, and this is a read operation, public static. So another extension, this iSession called session. Pass in a key, and it's going to return whatever type you're working with. We'll walk through this. Okay, so we have to be able to get an object. Again, the type is a generic type. We don't know what type. It could be a team. It could be whatever classes we're working with. We're going to pass in a key. So you pass in one value here. This first argument basically says what we're extending. We're going to pass in a key. We call getString, or session.getString, stored in a JSON object. If it's null, we don't really return any data. Otherwise, return the read operation of that JSON data. So these are two extension methods. Okay, what does this allow us to do? I can go back here into our controller, and let's comment out those two lines. And now HTTP context dot session context, not content. Now we've got a new method. That method didn't exist before. And so set object. Again, the first thing is our key, so which is team. And the next thing is our actual object that's a generic type. In this case, it is a team object. Right, so long story short, we condensed the 2 lines down into 1. And the book on multiple cases calls this code unwieldy. I thought that was funny. Our code is less unwieldy now, right? Our 2 lines are condensed down into 1. So that's a write operation. And on the read side, we would be able to comment those out. And we're working with context now. So I'll do team, my team equals context session dot, again, get object. That method used to not exist. Now you can see it's an extension method. Get object, and all you have to do is pass it a key, which we called it team. And okay, this is a good error message. Basically says, hey, I know you're getting an object, but I don't know what that object is, so you need to cast it. And so in order to cast it, you do this. Get object of type team. So this is saying, hey, I know what kind of data is coming out of the session variable. So now my team name. So we just refactored our code a little bit. Not a huge ordeal, but it does cover a new concept that, again, I don't think we've ever covered extension methods before. So I thought that was a good opportunity to do that. Yes.
Would you need to write like a new method or class for like different types of things, or could you use it all for?
Yeah, you can reuse this for all the different types. I mean,
it's like if it's team or like a player or whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
team or player or product.
Yeah.
Like literally, this code is good for all that.
Okay.
Yeah. It still works just the same. We put data into a session variable, we put data out of a session variable, but now it's an object. Well, more than that, it's less unwieldy. Okay, I think I will. Here what we're doing is we're working with an individual team and writing it to a session variable. Let's refactor that to have a list of teams. And so that's where we're going. Yep. So we'll say, and you could have a list of team, or we've kind of talked about var being that dynamic type. Var teams. Kind of like what we did before, you start with a read. I keep doing context, session. a new list of team. Okay, so start by reading out of the session variable. The key is teams, and you cast it into a list of teams. Again, just like I did before, if you leave this off, it's going to say, hey, you got to tell me what this is. I'm reading out of session, but what exactly am I reading? I'm reading a list of team. And if it's null, then make a new list. And let's do a teams.add. And let's add 2 teams. And now we write that. Now the first one is the key, so it's teams. Second one is the object, teams. Okay, so we can still use set object and get object, but now we're adding a list. And here, my teams get object a list of team called teams. Get object list of team. Otherwise, new lists. Context session get object list of team called teams. Let me just not seeing my error, so sometimes it's best to just retype. Context session get object type list of team. Oh, I don't have a list of team on this side. Hello. Okay. So you kind of like tell it its data type on the way in. You got to cast it on the way out. And now see if it would give me some We got team ID, we got team ID, and team name. Team dot name. So we're looping through my teams, printing out each team name.
Should need the at symbol in front of team.
Good idea. Good eye. Okay, so set object teams, plural. Okay, Green Bay Packers, Las Vegas Rams. So that was successful. Of course, you could also do at team dot team ID. Right. So that's working. So the next phase of this is the last little bit of theory before they actually rebuild the Teams app, which is a concept of a wrapper class is what they call it. And so again, the concept that we used before, which is like, hey, we're going to simplify this code. We're going to refactor this code in an effort to simplify it, is this idea of a wrapper class, that it kind of contains all of the functionality of what we've done so far. And so we're going to make a new class. It's going to be called My Session, and it's going to contain all the method calls and string keys and everything that works with the iSession object and the extension method. So again, just refactoring this, trying to simplify it one more time. So this is a wrapper class. We're going to add a new class, My Session. Now, whereas when we did the extension methods, those were pretty generic in nature and you could work with all sorts of objects. This is very specifically for working with NFL teams. And so again, we're just kind of wrapping all this logic into one container called My Session. Here's our constructor. Okay, we have this instance field called session, and in the constructor, we set that instance field. Session equals the value that's passed in. Teams key is teams. New list of team. Okay, so you can see this wrapper class is working with our extension methods called getObject and setObject. And so now to use this, okay, let's see how it cleans our code up even more, right? So here's our read operation on our teams. So let's comment this out. Comment that out here, comment out this here. First we have to instantiate our new class, right? So my session called session is new my session. We pass in the session object as HTTP context dot session. Var teams is equal to session dot get teams. That was the method that we wrote. Obviously that'll be like a new list of teams. Teams dot add. And we could pass in our two teams here. Session.setTeams teams. I don't know how much that cleaned it up. Meh, it just took the functionality from one place to another. I could live with or without it. But I do know that the next version of the NFL Teams app uses one of these wrapper classes. So you're just taking the method calls and putting them behind this class. To me, it is about the same. Okay, so that's putting data in. We got a list of teams. Let's go back to the view and pull this out. Var session. And over here it's context.session. And here's our list of team called teams. Session get teams. I believe we called it my teams. There we go. Refactored it for a second time. We get the same output. You just took that logic and you put it behind a class. I don't know that it really saved us a lot yet, but maybe as we dabble with this NFL Teams app 3.0, maybe it will. So everything up until this point was just demonstrating getting these things working. In the chapter, we're going on to actually use these concepts. So page 342 is basically where we're at. You could see they have some new functionality here. You could add multiple teams to your favorites. Last I recall, if you're looking at this, you click on here, you can add a team to favorites. And this is funny because that's what we have it coded right now. But obviously this is not.
It's adding it every time.
That's right. But kind of the idea here is you could only get one team added to favorites. And so now we'll have like a list of favorites kind of thing. Let me take out this for each here and take out this. And my session, we might refactor that a little bit. All right, so I'm on page 345. I'm looking at the extension methods. I believe we already have these coded exactly what we need. In fact, nothing is different here, just double checking. The only thing they did was refactor this if-else into a ternary operator, but it's going to work the same way, so I'm not going to touch it. This my session, in other words, this wrapper class, they build out a little bit more. So if you're following along in models, let's add another class. This is called NFL session. And I'm just going to follow as quickly as I can through page 345, the source code here. They make the point of like all of these keys being stored in constants, so you don't have typos. Instead, you're using these variables instead of the string literals throughout your source code. Makes it a little bit more readable as well. This constructor is built the exact same way as last time. So you call set my teams, passed in a list of teams. You store a session variable right here, session.setObject. Remember, setObject serializes it and saves it to session. So setObject does those two useful operations. I also set an int called count, our team count, to be the count property of the list, teams.count. So this is the first time we're saving multiple things. We're saving a list of teams to our session and a count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and an int. So that wasn't compiling because this should return. So if you put this line here and say return and then that line, now that compiles. Versus the arrow syntax. Okay. And we could do public int get my team count. Session get int 32. So one syntax versus the other. Of course, arrow's always nicer. So this returns a conference if it's got one, otherwise it returns an empty string. And set and get, I mean, these are like exactly, I'm going to copy those two things and paste, but instead of conf, it's div key, active div. Get active div key. All right, so that stores the conference into the session. This stores the division into session. Get it. Get the active division, get the active conference. Last thing is to remove all my teams. So here's public void. And so this will be used to clear out your session variables. One at a time. So that removes the teams key, that removes the count key. So that's our wrapper class. We did have a Teams view model. So we're going to add a property to store a single team. All right, the rest of our code stays the same from before. So a single team inside of our Teams view model. Back in our home controller, I'm undoing everything that I did. I'm just taking it back to what I had from the last time. And we'll create a new instance of our wrapper class. So var session is new NFL session, passing in our session object, context, comma, dot session. Set active division, set active conference. Okay, that's all that we're adding here. So we're storing the conference and the division in our session variable. Let's go down to our details method. And first thing we'll do, var session, new NFL session. First, our default. New team, comma, so that semicolon becomes a comma. We set the active I think that syntax here. Team equals yeah, see, var session, thank you, Vinny, or Amel, thank you. There we go. There we go. So I instantiate a team view model. It has a team, which it didn't have before. It has an active conference that we read from the session variable, and the active div that we read from the session variable. Okay, now it goes into the layout file, views, shared layout. Okay, so here's if our temp data contains message. We're still in the header. Now this controller isn't recognized because there's a little razor block up here where we read the controller. So now that we got that variable called controller, now that's recognized. Okay, now we've got a nested if. If count has value, you went from sounding like a dinosaur to sounding like a ghost. Okay, so if we have favorites, right? There's a count of favorites. Then we give a link to that favorites controller. We haven't created this favorites controller yet. Okay. So this gives us a link to a new controller. Go back to the home details view. We change this from a team model to a Teams view model. Then it becomes model.team.logo image. Team conference. Team.
Under the image tag, there's a tree.
Could I? Okay, so there's our form method post and our anchor tag. Index, class of button, button primary. So the first thing is return to home page. So this right here is the first link that they give. Return to home page. And they provide some route data, ASP, route, active, conf. Put this on one line. Okay, so there's our link to go home. Then a submit button. It says add to favorites, nothing changes there. And this is model.team.teamID. I don't know that we need this name, but let's just bring it along with. We're almost done, guys. Thank you for your patience. I'm not sure, as always, you'll probably learn best by doing versus just watching this, but an introduction nonetheless. All right, favorites controller. We do have a favorites controller, silly me. All right. Favorites controller inherits from controller. Okay, so let's call HTTP get a view result on index. Okay, so here we have a Teams view model, and we basically construct this model to get all of the data out of the session that we just got done wiring up to put that data in. back on the details view of the home controller, we put the data in. So we put the data in. On the details view of the home controller, on the details, so here, I'm sorry, that was set. It was get. Oh, here it is. The next method, literally the next method is our post where we put the data in. So, I'm gonna refactor this. Redirect to action results. First or default. Okay, so the add method passes in a single team. We take that team and include the conference and the division and save that to the list teams.add, and then save it back into session set my teams. Thank you.
Good. We should hire you.
Okay. And the last thing, so this will get that team added to the session variable, but we also need a delete method. So the last piece here, HTTP post. And I think this return statement is exactly the same. I'll double check that. Return, redirect to action, index home, new, active conf, active div. Just a little bit more. So the controller's been updated. And it wants me to reboot my application to get rid of that. Okay. And the last thing is the favorites index view. Which we don't have. So let's add a folder. Favorites. Okay, so now that gets us here. We didn't have this link last time that said my favorites teams. When you click it, it brings us here, and it does have a count of 1. I feel like I've stored Active Conference and Active Division like 13 different ways. I mean, at the end of the day, we've refactored the same app like 6 times, even though I'm exaggerating, but it feels that way.
What were that?
He works in the factory. Refactoring.
Okay, so our first link is just a home link that says back to home. So this calls the delete method. Of course, we just coded that delete method, which is a post, which calls our, basically this is the one method that's in the wrapper class. It's doing all the work. Session remove my teams. If I go here, remove my teams, calls the remove method of a session object to remove our 2 keys. Okay. So that should work. Close the div. Okay, so we have a list group. Inside the list group, we have list group items. Really interesting that inside of a list group item, we're looking at a row for each one of these. And then we're breaking it down into div class call small 4. So basically 3 of these. Divs, 1, 2, 3. Okay, inside of the first column, images, and then we got our team name, and then we've got the conference name and the team division name. Close the div, close the div, close the li, close the ul, close the div, close the div. Let's see what I broke. Anyone actually have a favorite NFL team?
Not the Rams.
Not the Rams, I agree.
The Chiefs, maybe, I guess. The Blues.
Okay. Chiefs. Yeah, I can go Chiefs. They just won the Super Bowl.
Second row all the way there.
There we go. Add to favorites. I'm going to go Buffalo Bills. That's my wife's from Buffalo. So now we've got 2 favorite teams.
Nice.
There they are. Clear the favorites. Favorites team's cleared. We now have version 3, but don't get content because literally 1 page of theory and then we're going to version 4. But you know, if you're gonna rewatch this video ever, probably the most like you get the most out of it in the first 40 minutes. Other than that, you're just following a code along of what the book does. That kind of demonstrates it. You know, in summary, you know, this saving to a session variable can be used to very efficiently, like, save information about a user's request or a trip with the database. You know, to store some data. It is one of the many tools that we've learned about, and then we'll get into some cookies tomorrow.